Well, thanks for being part of our podcast today. Gary Zacharias here. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. Let me pull off the shelf a good book that I go back to again and again for particular pieces of information. The old title was Under the Influence, How Christianity Transformed Civilization. Alvin Schmidt is the author. And I can understand under the influence means a different thing today. We think about drugs. So the title got changed, and that's fine. My old copy is Under the Influence. It's now called How Christianity Changed the World. I've done previous podcasts on this book. One was looking at the role of women in Christianity. One was Christianity in education. Another one was how Christianity led to a sanctifying of human life. Here's a tough one. This is chapter 11 in the book, Slavery Abolished, a Christian Achievement. And I know that's actually been one of the complaints that skeptics have brought up against Christianity, well, against the Judeo-Christian view of life, and said, it supported slavery. So I think it's time to take a look at this chapter and really think about it. The author, Schmidt, points out that slavery was indigenous to Africa and Arab countries before it came to Europe. So we always think somehow that it's the white person, it's the European who started this whole mess, but not true. I mean, catch this. By the time of Christ, slaves made up an estimated 75% of the population of Athens and over half of the Roman population. And it was all over the place among American Indians long before Columbus came along. With few exceptions, he says kings and priests and even philosophers approved of it. I mean, think about Aristotle. He saw it as natural, expedient, and just. You wonder, what were they thinking, just? Well, they said in ancient Greece, it was a little different than slavery that we think of like the antebellum South in America, but in ancient Greece, slaves did menial work, yes, but they also did work that required skilled labor. So that was interesting. Things like the Appian Way, the seven wonders of the ancient world, and even the sculptures of that time period were actually the work of slaves. I had to read that twice to take a look at that. I thought that was interesting. So he says also, many people don't know that slavery continued way after it was outlawed in the United States and the world. It was still around. Ethiopia had slavery until 1942. Saudi Arabia until 62. Peru until 64. India until 1976. And it's still in Sudan, as an example, Africa's largest country. That's awful. Why isn't it covered? Well, he says, and there may be something to it, that the mass media didn't really want to talk about that. Politically correct media and school textbooks, he says, give the impression it's been pretty much white people that did it against blacks. He says the fact that only about a quarter of the Americans in the South had slaves before the Civil War is not mentioned. Right? So about a fourth of the people in the South, even in the South, just a fourth had slaves. And they said, this is another one I read twice, 407 black Americans in Charleston, South Carolina alone. 400, a little more than 400 in South Carolina. This is in 1830, a census. They owned black slaves. So you have black Americans in this country owning slaves. Whoa, okay. Then he mentions, do you know that there's a Christian organization called Christian Solidarity International? They're buying slaves out of slavery to set them free. They pay something like, in Sudan, something like 50,000 Sudanese pounds per slave. Wow. So he says, let's look at the history. So if you go back, Paul is telling Philemon not to treat Onesimus, that was his slave, as a slave, but as a brother. It's a great story. Hardly anybody ever reads Philemon in the Bible, but it's a wonderful letter that Paul writes. So what had happened is Onesimus had run away and was being returned to his owner. So Paul is writing this letter to somehow, in a kind way, basically tell Philemon to treat him differently. Don't treat him as a runaway slave and punish him. He told Philemon that as a Christian, he was no longer to practice slavery. And he also told the Galatians, he said, from the Christian perspective, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's amazing. They said, think about slavery. It existed all over the world. Paul saying that was really revolutionary. Now, some people say, well, why didn't Paul come out and say, let's get rid of slavery right now. I'll lead the crusade. And Schmidt doesn't cover that, but this is just me talking. You can see what you think. I think Paul's message of the Christian belief was to change hearts one at a time, rather than try to overthrow a political system and then try to impose people to be nice. So I don't know, that may be something to that as well. So Paul's words were really revolutionary, and those two passages in Philemon and Galatians ended up laying the foundation for the abolition of slavery back then and now. So you've got other actions and statements in the early church. Christians interacted with slaves as they did with freemen. Slaves communed with Christians at the same altar in the first few centuries here. Said that wasn't the way the Romans did things. They held slaves in contempt, as well as the Greeks. Here's what Aristotle said: a slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. Therefore, there can be no friendship with a slave as slave. And he goes on to say Christians actually freed many slaves in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Right? This is pretty early. The Christians, it says, in urban households were freeing slaves frequently. It was performed in church in the presence of a bishop. Now, we don't know the numbers. We don't know how many, but there were many. Here's a reference. One Saint Melania was said to have emancipated 8,000. A rich martyr in Gaul, Saint Ovidius, 5,000. A Roman prefect, Chromatius, under Diocletian, freed 1,400, and on and on. Constantine, 315 A.D., only 2 years after the Edict of Milan, imposed the death penalty on people who stole children to bring them up as slaves. So that's interesting. In the 4th century, Lactantius, they call him the Christian Cicero, he said, in God's eyes there were no slaves. St. Augustine, now we're up to the 350s to 400 A.D., saw slavery as a product of sin and contrary to God's divine plan. Chrysostom, another saint in the 4th century, he preached that when Christ came, he annulled slavery. So this had a big effect on the society of the time. Slavery was condemned in the 5th century by St. Patrick in Ireland. For several centuries, there were bishops and councils that recommended the redemption of captive slaves. By the 12th century, think about this, by the 12th century, slaves in Europe were rare, and by the 14th century, slavery was almost unknown on the continent. So that really flies in the face of, oh, well, it's Christians who like slavery. No, this is when Christianity was getting really powerful, and by the 14th century, they said slavery was just about unknown. Wow. Said multitudes of slaves were grateful, and they embraced the new faith. Some even became priests of the church. In the early 3rd century, there was a one-time slave named Callistus, became not only a priest but a bishop. The Roman Catholic Church lists him as one of its early popes. Some slaves were even honored as martyrs. So this, to me, really throws out the idea of Christianity loving slavery. Now, I like it. He points out, he said, in spite of Paul's words, many Christians did own slaves, and even some prominent church leaders did. Polycarp did. Athenagoras did. Clement of Alexandria spoke approvingly of it, so that's not good. But he said there were 3 important truths that these erring Christians said, or that he's believing about this. These early Christians who did like slavery, thought it was okay, they were sinful beings. So they either were ignoring Paul's words or just ignorant of them. Or another problem might have been that they let the prevailing culture of pagan societies influence their behavior. And then they were ignoring Christ's words that said his followers were to be in the world, but not of it. Okay, well, here comes the problem, of course. Around the 17th century, slavery was revived by the British, especially in their colonies. Oh, man, that's sad. Slaves ended up being transported from Africa to the colonies in the British West Indies, to the American colonies, and on to Canada. This revival of slavery was terrible. Yeah. Serious-minded Christians, though, even in this time, saw slavery as a gross violation of basic Christian beliefs, and they battled against slavery. And, of course, the one that always comes to mind that he mentions is William Wilberforce. He was a member of England's House of Commons, and he was a devout Christian. He said the Christian's motto should be, "Watch always, for you know not what hour the Son of Man will come." And he also said, "Help me, O Jesus, and by thy Spirit cleanse me from my pollutions. Give me a deeper abhorrence of sin. Let me press forward." So he believed everybody was saved by grace. And he, I think it was Sir Walter Scott, I guess, that Schmidt talks about here, credited Wilberforce with being a leader of the religious members in Parliament. He gave a lot of powerful speeches against slavery. And he appealed over and over again to the Christian consciences of the English. In 1823, his health was deteriorating. He presented a petition to the House of Commons to abolish slavery. It was a moving thing to do. A few days before he died, he received word that Parliament passed the Abolition Act that freed 700,000 slaves by England in its West Indies colonies. And when he heard that, even though he was dying, he said, "Thank God I should have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery." So no proponent for the abolition of slavery ever accomplished more. I thought that was a good point that Schmidt brought up. So slavery came to a complete end in all the British Empire's possessions by 1840. It was the first modern country to outlaw slavery. Well, what about America? Well, in the U.S., it had become, unfortunately, a deeply entrenched institution, even especially in the southern states. So it had ardent defenders, and unfortunately, many of them were Christians. So I appreciate Schmidt admitting that. Virtually every American church denomination, he said, had pro-slavery advocates. They would cite men's innate sinfulness, the historic precedent, the so-called inferiority of the black people, and economic necessity. And it was a heated issue in the North and the South. Yeah, it became a huge thing. Among pro-slavery clergy, there were actually some graduates of Yale and Princeton. There were strong voices against them, though, the abolitionists. They had, I would say, the mind of Christ, and they had references to the New Testament on their side. And many American defenders, they call themselves Christians, but the abolitionist movement had a far higher percentage of Christian clergy than did the pro-slavery defenders. So that's good to know. So what did some of the Christian clergy do? Well, here's one. Elijah Lovejoy. He was killed by a rioting pro-slavery group in his printing office. He's cited as the abolitionist's first martyr. That was 1837. He was a Presbyterian clergyman. He had a strong stand against slavery. Cost him his life. He said, "I shall come out openly, fearlessly, and as I hope, in such a manner as becomes a servant of Jesus Christ when defending his cause." A close friend and supporter of his was Edward Beecher. He served as president of Illinois College. He was a strong promoter of the abolitionist cause. Black students were welcome there at his college. It was a Christian institution. And like his friend Lovejoy, he was a Presbyterian clergyman. By the way, if that name Beecher sounds familiar, he's the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Here's another place, a clergy connecting with anti-slavery. It was a place called the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. And Lyman Beecher was a well-known preacher. He became the school's first president. He's the father of Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Lane Cemetery, that seminary, the reason Schmidt is talking about it is that it had ties to Ohio, New York anti-slavery society. So they were really involved in that. Then we have it says about the same time that the Lane Seminary came along, which is the early 1800s, another reverend began the Oberlin Institute, and so that got going. And at Oberlin, you see how all these colleges and people are kind of intersect. At Oberlin College, Charles Finney, he was a former Freemason, a charismatic preacher of revivalism. He joined the faculty there. Eventually, he became the college's president. And in the 1820s, Schmidt said, Finney used his charisma. He converted a large section of his audiences to evangelicalism during revival meetings. And he used his charisma to convert people to abolitionism. So I didn't know that. I knew he was a preacher. I'd heard of his name, Finney, but I didn't know he was really involved in abolition work. All right, let's see. One of his converts, so here we go again. So we had Oberlin College, and they produced Finney, and then Finney produces anti-slavery movements. And then one of his converts was Theodore Weld. He joined the Oberlin faculty, and in 1839, he wrote a best-selling book on anti-slavery called Slavery as It Is. And that was one of the resources that Harriet Beecher Stowe used when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Oberlin College became big in promoting abolitionism. So here's another person, another clergyman, called the father of the Underground Railroad, Charles Torrey. He's credited, imagine this, he led organizations to the point of helping something like 100,000 fugitive slaves escape northward to freedom. Wow. He actually died a martyr's death in a jail while serving time for helping slaves get out. So Schmidt underlines what all these people were doing by saying that it was Christ's teachings that moved these different clergy individuals and these theological seminaries toward being anti-slavery. How about non-clergy roles? Were there people that were involved even, they were religious but not necessarily clergy? Yeah, here's a famous one, William Garrison. He was a Baptist. He was called ultra-Orthodox in his religious beliefs. He founded a periodical called The Liberator. He pushed really hard for abolition. As a Christian, he would often quote the passage from Christ's parable, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He was so strong against slavery, he would sometimes chastise Christian denominations for doing too little. And he actually went after clergy sometimes. He said the cause of abolition has to be kept in the hands of laymen or it will not be maintained. Wow. So some people saw him as pretty radical, but he never advocated violence. It was always Christian non-resistance. So interesting. There's him. There are some others. I think I'll move along here. How about Harriet Beecher Stowe? Most people have heard about Uncle Tom's Cabin. I actually had a chance to teach it at college. And here I am, an adult, and I hadn't read it, even though my major was literature in college, English literature. I hadn't read it. I thought, oh boy, is this going to be good for the students or not? And I was captivated by the book. It still has a powerful impact. Hardly anybody knows, I didn't know this, there was a Christian motivation behind Harriet Beecher Stowe writing this book. She casts Uncle Tom as a suffering servant, and he's a little like Christ. He doesn't take revenge, although his other slaves tell him to. He clings to the promises of Christ right up to his death. One analyst that looked at the book said Uncle Tom, the book, takes a Christian approach, that suffering is redemptive and that evil will be atoned for. And the book has all sorts of biblical passages. So pretty neat. One time, I thought it was interesting, a sea captain met her, said, "Oh, I'm so happy to shake the hand of the person who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin." She said, "I didn't write the book. God wrote it. I merely did his dictation." And she was a Christian. So a powerful person there. Christianity sustained the slaves. Here's another part of the chapter. They helped the slaves themselves. They pushed whites to get rid of slavery, Christianity did, but they also sustained the slaves that were stuck in it. Even a person like Eugene Genovese, he was once a Marxist, he credits Christianity as the single institution that enabled the black slaves to survive this prolonged dehumanization process. Yeah, interesting. It says churches would give opportunities for at least emotional release for the slaves. They would give them social interaction, gave them educational opportunities. It helped with their sick and bereaved. There was a social cohesion that let them stay together, gave them solace, gave them comfort, gave them leadership opportunities. I think about what's happened to the African American community in the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. The church has lost its impact, and as a result, I think it's really hurt people in the African American community. And they go on and said the Christian religion continues to be highly important to American blacks even today. Yeah, I think it is. Maybe not as powerful as it once was. And then what about the American Civil Rights Movement? So there was racial segregation, unfortunately, that's still around. But think about Martin Luther King Jr. He helped set up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Look at that name. It had Christian teachings, beliefs, and values. It pushed the idea of nonviolence. King was the first president. He always talked about being nonviolent. He wanted the members to actually imitate the early Christians. He said they were small in number, but big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. He wanted American Christians to do what those early Christians had done to end the evils of segregation and racism. So clergy from a lot of Christian denominations joined those peaceful, nonviolent marchers that were led by King. He said there are going to be some skeptics. There always are. But he said skeptics who deny that slavery was abolished in the Western world as a result of Christianity, he said they need to ponder the following questions. So I want to go over these real quickly, but I think they're important. Here's what Schmidt is asking. Was slavery first abolished in countries where Christianity had a major or minor presence? The answer is they were first abolished in countries that had major Christian presence. Here's a second question. Did Christianity have a major or minor presence in the countries that retained slavery into the 20th century? Well, that's the flip side, isn't it? Christians have had a minor presence in places like Sudan. Christianity is not the dominant religion there. It's been virtually non-existent. So he said, the answers to these questions make it clear that slavery and Christianity are poor companions. Historical evidence shows a high correlation between Christianity and the abolition of slavery. So, good point. So that gives you an idea of what his book is like. He finds things that are so interesting that I didn't know about, and give me a clearer sense of the power and the presence of Christianity as it changed society for the better. Well, thanks for being part of our podcast. Take care.